Hello, this is Terrence McNally. Craig Venter, the entrepreneurial scientist who decoded the human genome, died last week at the age of 79. The New York Times obituary labels him a rebel by nature and leads with these words: a risk-taking outsider, he brought speed, competition, and controversy to one of science's biggest races. In 2000, he and his team published the first sequence of the human genome earlier and for far less money than the government-sponsored Human Genome Project. In the first half hour, you'll hear our 2008 conversation on the publication of his memoir, A Life Decoded, My Genome, My Life. And you can learn more at jcvi.org. In the second half, you'll hear my 2008 conversation with MacArthur Award-winning evolutionary biologist Stuart Kauffman about his book, Reinventing the Sacred, A New View of Science, Reason, and Religion. The two of us get rather excited as we work our way toward his notion that the universe's ceaseless creativity may be the best way yet to conceive of God. And you can learn more at Stuart Kauffman. That's one word, but Stuart is S-T-U-A-R-T, and Kauffman is K-A-U-F-F-M-A-N, stuartkaufman.com. Hello, I'm Terry McNally, and welcome to Free Forum. This is a quote: "From positively impacting human health and better treating disease, to enabling a better understanding of the environment and potentially creating new biological sources of energy, genomics is the field of science that has the power to transform the world around us." Those words are taken from the website of the J. Craig Venter Institute. One of the great landmarks in the history of science, and perhaps of humanity, occurred when Craig Venter and his team published the first sequence and analysis of the human genome. What made this event so remarkable was not only the accomplishment itself, but the fact that it was achieved earlier and for less money than the government-sponsored Human Genome Project. Venter is a remarkable and, I'd say, an entrepreneurial scientist. As such, he asks huge questions, takes on huge challenges, and has achieved huge successes. Weekly, those of you who listen on a regular basis know that I say that Free Forum explores the lives, the work, and the ideas of individuals that I suspect have pieces of the puzzle of a world that just might work. We look at new, innovative, provocative approaches to business, environment, health, science, politics, and culture, all based on the fact that I believe we can do better, and I want to find out how. Craig Venter and his work involve an awful lot of that weekly quoted mission. In September 2007, a team led by Venter published his complete DNA sequence. That's his own complete DNA sequence, in unveiling the 6 billion letter genome of a single individual for the first time. And Craig Venter has authored a new book, A Life Decoded, My Genome, My Life. Welcome, Craig Venter, to Free Forum.
Thank you. Nice to be with you.
Very good. I like listeners to get a feel for the people behind the work and the ideas. And your book weaves your own biography with the stories of the scientific breakthroughs. You were an average and an indifferent student, perhaps even a bit of a troublemaker. How do you explain your transformation to an eminent scientist, and how do you link your later success with your earlier failure?
Well, it's actually it's an important question. I wasn't even an average student. I was deliberately below average, I think. I enjoyed building boats, swimming, surfing in the cold waters off of Northern California. My friends and I had one wetsuit we traded between us. But anything other than school was enjoyable. I graduated from high school barely. I got a D- instead of an F in a government class. I knew my government instructor was a very right-wing, and this was 1964. I wrote a paper on why I thought Barry Goldwater should be president, and so he was so pleased he graduated me. So it was the ultimate irony of getting me out the door.
I was class of 65. It would have worked for me, too, I'll tell you. And then?
And then I moved to Southern California. I left home at age 17 to take up a surfing career. It didn't last long. I got drafted off my surfboard in 1965. Unbeknownst to the naive world I grew up in California, the war was expanding in Vietnam, and I was soon to become part of it. So I ended up in the Navy as a medical corpsman after treating infectious disease for a while in Balboa Hospital. I got sent to Vietnam.
And you mentioned that experience in Vietnam was really impactful in all sorts of ways for the future, for the fact that you actually are still alive, and for what you've done with your life since then.
It shows, in fact, how important the environment is and how what happens to us in life can totally change the directions. I found that knowledge was power. The more knowledge I had, the more people's lives I could save, the more I could do. But also dealing with life and death every day in the most intense fashion, including during the Tet Offensive. I began to question life, what it was, how it existed, what it meant when it disappeared. And I felt I couldn't go back to just being a surfer, and I started my life over in a community college.
Isn't there a moment where you actually attempt suicide or are on the verge of attempting suicide?
Yes, it was after being there about 6 months. I was just very upset with the policies that had us there. Nobody there believed in it, and certainly as a 20-year-old dealing with large numbers of young men my own age being killed or severely maimed, it just all seemed senseless. And I decided to try and get away from it by swimming out into the sea, but a shark interrupted my train, and I quickly changed directions, and hadn't thought about that since.
Yeah, but you say that actually it was and I can imagine in the swimming back, and you say you pass the lives of the people in Vietnam and so on, and you realize that how selfish that would have been.
Yeah, in fact, on my way back from the beach of doing that, I passed all these bamboo cages that you could only squat in that were full of Viet Cong and POWs that clearly wouldn't have understand that act. They were really kept as animals in cages, and it was a combination of all these things at once that I decided to make sure I accomplished something with my life if I survived the rest of the year there.
And how did that accomplishment end up in science?
Well, I decided I was going to come back and go through 12 years of school to get back to doing what I was doing in Vietnam, practicing medicine. One of the most exciting things I did, I was a doctor for a small village, an orphanage, and it was incredibly rewarding using my knowledge to affect people's lives. My plan was to come back and practice third world medicine, but it was actually after a year and a half in a community college, transferred to UC San Diego, I was introduced to high-end science as an undergraduate. And I made an early discovery on how adrenaline worked on cells, and there was no turning back. I just fell in love with science, the fact that you could use your brain to solve problems about the basic world around us, and that knowledge would affect a large number of people. I published my first scientific paper as an undergraduate, and I was hooked for life.
Let me say that in reading your book, it seems that once we get into the science part, it is as much about the science or as much about the politics that goes on in science as it is about the science itself. So let me read you a couple of quotes, and then I'm going to ask you to talk about that whole issue, okay? One is the thing I said in the intro, which is that one of the great landmarks in the history of science and of humanity occurred when Craig Venter published the first sequence and analysis of the human genome, that you did it earlier and for less money than the government-sponsored Human Genome Project. And my question about that is, what, if anything, in that is still, to some people, controversial?
Well, it's clearly controversial to the people that I beat. That they will probably go to their graves not forgiving me for that. Look, it was a large, multi-billion-dollar federal program that didn't really allow room for new ingenuity. And we came along with an idea. We actually decoded the first genomes in history and then set out to apply these same new techniques using computers, high-end math, small teams, and automation to do what was supposed to take tens of thousands of scientists and billions of dollars to do. And we couldn't get the funds from the government to do it. An instrument manufacturer came along and offered me $300 million to sequence the human genome. The only catch was I had to form a company with them to do it. We put a stipulation that we had to be able to publish the data in the scientific literature. They agreed to that, and we sequenced it in 9 months for $100 million instead of 15 years for $3 billion.
Okay, and what I'm not sure you said, or at least I didn't hear, was that you actually were within the government program.
Yes, I was at NIH for 9 years of my career, and it was actually a great period of time. The intramural program is very different than how we fund science at universities. There I had a multi-million-dollar budget and could do what I wanted to do. I just outgrew it trying to work on scaling up to do the human genome, and was offered my own research institution, which I formed in 1992. And that led first to the first genome in history and then to the human genome.
And the first genome was bacteria,
It was a bacteria, Haemophilus influenzae, that causes ear infections in kids and meningitis.
Okay. Now let me read you another quote. This one is from that learned journal, the Wikipedia. But, the Wikipedia is now, as I'm sure, as read, if not more, than any other pedia around. And it talks about, this is a quote from Wikipedia, in the Craig Venter biography, the aim of the Celera project, which is the company that you went to when you left the National Institute of Health, was to create a database of genomic data that users could subscribe to for a fee. This proved very unpopular in the genetics community and spurred several groups to redouble their efforts to produce the full sequence and release it as open access. The Human Genome Project, which was composed of many groups from around the world, rendered the attempt to privatize the process unfeasible. How much of that is accurate to your
Wikipedia
reading?
Doesn't always get it right.
Right.
It sounds like one of my competitors wrote my biography. In fact, the goal was, and what we did was made the sequence all publicly available. So the challenge of those who offered me the $300 million to sequence the human genome, after agreeing that I could publish it and release it, they said, okay, well, we're going to give you all this money to do it. You have to come up with a business plan that makes us look credible with this. So we came up.
And let me just point out to listeners, what you're saying is, since you made a condition of your moving there that you would make stuff publicly available, they're going, well, how do we tell our investors that we're going to make money from
Exactly.
this? Yeah.
That was precisely the discussion. And we came up with the Bloomberg model of which is not owning data, it's not owning information, it's adding value to it by creating databases and unique combinations of data that make it far easier to use that. And so our competitors knew we weren't tying up the genome. They knew we were not patenting the genome. Biologists apparently play very badly when you threaten their $3 billion budgets. And I think people said a lot of things back then that I'm sure they regret. That had nothing to do with the science. It wasn't a clean competition when they went after us for anything they could to try and discredit us. They all, by the way, have all adopted the tools that they were so trying to discredit. Every lab in the world now uses what we proposed. And that's how science moves forward. It's unfortunate. It's human nature. That's the history of scientific breakthroughs. You can't get support for them. Then a few years later, everybody says they were obvious and you didn't really do anything unique. So that's what happened here. And it was interesting because it was so public and showed that, if anything, scientists are at least as human as the rest of the population.
Yeah, let me just share with you, Craig, I actually saw in previews a play on Broadway, which is, do you know what I'm talking about?
I've seen part of the script. I haven't seen the play.
This is the Sorkin play about the Farnsworth experiment, with the Farnsworth invention, which is the invention of television, and such a similar story there.
You find it repeated throughout human history.
Any breakthrough worth having is...
Well, they don't come easy, and I guess that it's the test of whether people believe in what they're doing. So now, because I believed it, and I'm charged with having the largest ego on the planet. So you're damned if you do and damned if you don't. But believing in yourself, and I had a wonderful team of scientists that I believed in totally, and they proved that they could do things beyond which even they thought they were capable of. It
Faster.
was one of the most exciting periods in science, actually, with what was accomplished. And I think history will eventually show that.
Okay, let me tell people again, you're listening to Free Forum. I'm Terry McNally, and I'm speaking with Craig Venter. He is a pioneer in the world of genomic research, as you've heard, the author of a new book called A Life Decoded, My Genome, My Life. And as you can tell, it deals with, I think, three stories. His own personal story of, how do you end up being the guy that does this sort of stuff? And then the science involved, and then the politics of the science involved. And the last chapters, which we'll deal with before the show is over, are some of the questions you're asking now and some of the things you're working on now, which are, I think, as exciting as the work you've already done. Let me ask, if you've gotten to where you can make the science part of this understandable in a brief way, in other words, what were the breakthroughs that allowed you guys to do it and to do it quicker and cheaper?
So our genome is 6 billion letters of genetic code. So the question is, how do you decode? How do you read those 6 billion letters? The best technology could read 600 to 800 letters at a time. And so the challenge is, it's like, how do you read a Sunday LA Times if you can only do 800 letters at a time, and it's all in smaller pieces? So the federal program broke things up into fairly large chunks, about 100,000 letters long, and distributed those around the country and around the world in a multi-sweatshop operation to try and decode those. With what we developed with whole genome shotgun sequencing, we use unique mathematical tools and high-end computing to basically solve jigsaw puzzles. Assembling genomes is very similar to solving a jigsaw puzzle. You pick up one piece and you compare it to all the others. With the genome, we have 800 letters of genetic code that you compare to all the other pieces until you find overlaps. It turns out we had 27 million pieces, so you can't do that manually in any one lifetime. But we, in 1999, built the third largest computer in the world to actually help us with that calculation. So we substituted high-performance computing, new mathematical algorithms, and automation for tens of thousands of scientists.
In other words, that's partially why you could work quicker and why you could work cheaper.
That's right.
In other words, once you invest in that piece of technology, you've now, everything else, the cost reduces.
The biggest costs were all the people involved around the world. We did it in one building with a small team because we had used computational tools to replace manual labor.
So at one point there, that you're using very, very cutting-edge computational tools, new modeling or new computing insights. What was it, do you think, that made the others doubtful of that, so that they kept doing it sort of with this year's technology instead of next year's?
I think the problem is just the nature of building large federal programs. Once they're set in motion, it's like trying to steer a giant barge down the Mississippi River. There's really no room to turn. It's too bulky of a bureaucracy. And basically, they were afraid if our method worked, it sort of shattered their entire program, which, in fact, it almost did.
And let me put that in real-world terms. In other words, if they've got a program that's projected to cost $3 billion, that's $3 billion that's going to go into somebody's pockets along the way, all those scientists around the world, the people who manage it. And if you're showing that it can be done with a new tool, quicker, leaner, what about that $3 billion, right?
Yeah, and that's what I think several of the people that were most vocal in their attacks were worried about. Is we actually did it for $100 million. They were worried about Congress cutting off their budget, so they resorted to the name calling and the trying to create fear that we were going to tie it up in a commercial company, which was nonsense because they were doing it at the same time. It would have been impossible anyway. Nobody ever examined the sensibility of it. The good thing is the competition brought it much more to the public attention.
Exactly. People love a story, and there's more of a story when you've got competition.
That's right. And so probably more people know the word genome than they would have any other way. So maybe it really served a public purpose.
Interesting. You also, the thing that I mentioned also in the top, which is that you have, since that breakthrough, you've since sequenced one individual's genome. That for people, just to put it in shorthand, that one that you did originally was parts of 5 different people.
It was a composite of 5 different people, and the public program was a composite. It was only half the genome, but it was a composite of maybe 200 different ones. Turns out neither represented humanity in underestimated human-to-human variation. So coming out of 2001, the assumption was we all had the same set of genes, and we only differed in 1 letter of genetic code out of 1,000 from each other. It didn't make sense to me then that we could cover the diversity of humanity with that. And so we went back and did it much more completely, looking at the whole set of the genome, the chromosomes that we get from both of our parents. And it turns out you and I differ from each other by 1 to 2%. Versus 1 letter out of 1,000. And let me put that number in context. We thought we only differed from chimps by 1.27%.
That's exactly what I've read.
So fortunately, that number has changed too, or we would be in deep trouble.
If we differed less from each other than we did from chimps?
Yes. So it turns out we differ from chimps by 5 to 6% when you look at the totality of the genome, the complete diploid genome. But it makes me much more comfortable with the range of humanity that we're 1 to 2% different across 3 billion people. As an individualist, I certainly like that notion, and it makes the biology a lot more comprehensible.
So what is, just because I have often referred to that chimp number, what is the accurate number now? It had gone up from 93 to 98.5 kind of, and what is it really now?
It's probably more like 94 to 95% when you take all the variations into account. There's regions when you align them, it does show up at the 1.27% difference, but it was that same kind of reasoning that got us in trouble with comparing humans at the 0.01% level.
Okay. So let me ask now, and let me tell people first that the voice you're hearing is Craig Venters. He was the leader of the team that first sequenced the human genome, and his team was also the first to sequence an individual human genome.
The first diploid genome, which is the complete genome.
With Watson, they didn't do that same process, right?
Well, Watson's is still pending scientific publication.
Okay. I find the stuff you're working on now for the future at the Venter Institute and so on really exciting. And I'm going to mention 3 things and then ask you to tell me about them. One is the medical part of, I guess what do you call it? Human genomic medicine.
Right.
Then there's environmental genomics, which is quite exciting. And then there's synthetic life. Synthetic life. So let's talk about each of those. What's going on now? I think the hope people have always had for this was that it would help us medically.
So we're trying to set up to do 10,000 human genomes over the next decade. We have the tools to answer virtually all the questions about what's nature and what's nurture. Once we can understand that, we can go into this preventative medicine paradigm by knowing what our genetic code will tell us about the future risk for disease. And as medicine progresses, we'll be able to do more and more to alter our genetic destiny by changing our lifestyle, taking preventative drugs such as statins, changing behavior.
And let me ask a quick question on that. I interviewed Matt Ridley when he did Nature via Nurture. He's the author of The Genome, but also Nature via Nurture, in which he said the old battle of is it environment or is it genetics, he says it's really an ongoing interaction. What was fascinating to me was I had come down to the idea that you were born with a blueprint and it kind of acted out, and your environment would interact with that. But he says it's interacting on a constant basis.
No, he's right. He's a great author and wrote a very understandable background book on genomics that people might want to refer to. It is ongoing. Our genetic code won't predict our life outcomes. It will give us statistical probabilities, and examples I use in boxes throughout my book talking about different gene variations that I have and what they might mean. And I show simple examples like eye color. You can't look at my genetic code and know for certainty that I will have blue eyes. I have a high statistical probability, and that's what the genome's going to give us is probabilities, very few yes/no answers.
Right. And you even point out a few where it doesn't seem to jibe. I think you say that you get your best work done late at night, you sleep, you're not an early riser, and that in your genome that wouldn't show up.
Exactly. I sort of came up the opposite in there, and And I sort of show those things to help put in context that attributing complex behaviors to single genes is extremely unlikely. And so I try to make some degree of fun with these. There's supposedly a risk-taking allele. It turns out I have a moderate one, which made people quite happy that it was at least that far along. Just because things show up as correlations doesn't mean they're in any way causal. And
right.
Trying to explain complex behavior on the basis of one or a few genes, we need to dispel those notions because it's important for eliminating the fear of the genetic code from a genetically deterministic type of thinking.
I see what you're saying. Yeah, the more that we realize it's an ongoing real-time interaction, the less fear there should be in getting the information.
Yes. We are very genetic animals in the sense that almost every human trait has a genetic component. But as we've shown from single cells with the minimal genome and with synthetic life, you can't define any life based on its genetic code alone. It's the genetic code plus the environment. If that's true for the most basic single cell, with our 100 trillion cells, environment is absolutely essential.
I'll tell you what, we're probably not going to get to synthetic life, but talk about this environmental genomics and the work that you've been doing in the ocean.
Well, in fact, a fourth biography in my book is actually a sailing biography from having my first sailboat, a Lightning in Vietnam, to combining my two loves of science and sailing. By doing a circumnavigation and taking samples of water every 200 miles and sequencing all the DNA that we isolate from organisms in that water. And we found as many as 40,000 species in a barrel of seawater.
Now, let me just, often I repeat things because I have a feeling if I were listening, I wouldn't quite catch that.
40,000 species.
40,000 species in what would be just a barrel of ocean water.
That's right. And these are unique. 85% of them are unique every 200 miles throughout the ocean. So instead of the ocean being a giant homogeneous soup, it's millions of unique environments. In one paper earlier this year, we described 6 million new genes, which more than doubled the number of genes discovered by science in the public databases. So we're at the early linear stages of discovery on our own planet.
What's the value of that, specifically, let's say, in terms of climate change?
Well, we've known the chemistry of the oceans. We haven't known the biology behind that chemistry. One of the things we found were organisms near the surface have a photoreceptor similar to our own rhodopsins in our eyes that capture sunlight, convert that to electrical energy in the cell. That's how they live in these low nutrient environments. That's part of the carbon cycle. But also, we're using those same tools, those same genes now to develop synthetic fuels by biological processes. We have a new possible jet fuel, an additive to replace ethanol that we make by engineering cells through these synthetic genomic processes. So it gives us an understanding of the environment, but even more excitingly, perhaps some ways to break our dependency of taking carbon out of the earth, burning it, and putting it in the atmosphere.
And I think the other part of it that I read was to maybe fiddle with some of those organisms so that they absorb more carbon than they are.
Well, in fact,
on both ends of it. Right?
Yes, the ultimate source for renewable energy is that we can capture the carbon back from CO2, convert that into sugars, then into fuels, and then recapture that in a continuous cycle.
Okay. What's the biggest question you're asking yourself right now, very briefly?
I think I'm very worried about what this experiment we're doing with our planet of putting this massive amount of carbon in the atmosphere. I'm an experimental scientist. I don't want to take this experiment to conclusion because it may have a catastrophic ending. So if we can, as quickly as possible, break our dependency on oil and coal, we have a chance for maybe reversing some of this damage before we get to that critical point.
Excellent. So again, the book is A Life Decoded. A website where you can learn more is jcvi.org. JCVI, that's the J. Craig Venter Institute.org. Thank you to G, my engineer, Stan Mizrahi in production, Matt Perez in traffic. To you, my listeners, I look forward to being with you again next week. Email me at temcnally@mac.com if you want to comment on anything or ask questions, you want CDs of old interviews, or if you want to get on my weekly list where I send you an email telling you who's going to be on and what we're going to talk about. You can find this interview at temcnally.podomatic.com, temcnally.podomatic.com. All my interviews go up there and stay there in perpetuity. Thank you, Craig Venter, and keep up the good work.
Thanks for having me with you.
Okay. This is Terrence McNally. In the second half, you'll hear my 2008 conversation with MacArthur Award-winning evolutionary biologist Stuart Kaufman about his book, Reinventing the Sacred, A New View of Science, Reason, and Religion. He suggests that the universe's ceaseless creativity may be the best way yet to conceive of God. And you can learn more at stuartkauffman.com, STUART KAUFFMAN, stuartkauffman.com. Hello and welcome to Free Forum. I'm Terry McNally. I wrote something in January 2005 reflecting on the 2004 election in which I felt the deciding factor may well have been the significant percentage of Bush voters who were misinformed about whether or not we'd found WMD in Iraq or Saddam had been involved with al-Qaeda or 9/11. I drew a bigger lesson from this triumph of ignorance. This is what I wrote. Quote, for a system or an organism to thrive and evolve, intelligence should offer guidance and direction. With unprecedented technological power, humanity now more than ever needs intelligent direction. Yet intelligence is not in the driver's seat, at least not in America, still the world's most powerful entity. It is underperforming and under siege. Losing out to ignorance, greed, ideology, cleverness is not an option. The stakes are too high, whether in war, terror, or environmental catastrophe. Now, it strikes me that intelligence has been defined by so many as just cognitive, brainiac intelligence, and that we need to create a more robust definition that includes emotional, physical, spiritual, intuitive intelligence, so that intelligence can connect with and engage the greater society. So then I started seeking out guests with something to say about these and related issues such as the roles of religion and science in society. I even came up with a book title for a collection of such interviews, Wrestling with Religion and Reality. In preparing to interview today's guest, Stuart Kaufman, I got truly excited that in his thinking and in his new book, Reinventing the Sacred, A New View of Science, Reason, and Religion, he has pulled together some very big ideas that go a long way to making sense of the largest dilemmas we face, and that he envisions a way forward that might restore our chances for success. Here on Free Forum, we explore the lives, the work, the ideas of individuals that I suspect have pieces of the puzzle of a world that just might work. We look at new, innovative, provocative approaches to business, environment, health, science, politics, media, culture, all based on the fact that I believe we can do better, and I want to find out how. Stuart Kaufman is the director of the Institute for Biocomplexity and Informatics at the University of Calgary. He's a MacArthur Fellow and an external professor at the Santa Fe Institute. He's the author of The Origins of Order, At Home in the Universe, The Search for Laws of Self-Organization, Investigations, and his newest, Reinventing the Sacred, A New View of Science, Reason, and Religion. Welcome, Stuart Kaufman, to Free Forum.
I'm so glad to be here. Thank you for having me.
Now, I like listeners to get a feel for the people behind the work and the ideas. So, you were originally a medical doctor. Your primary work has been as a theoretical biologist studying the origin of life, molecular organization. You've also applied the science of complexity to business management. And then in your newest book, you take on the biggest questions of religion and science. Could you briefly talk about your path to the work that you're doing today?
Well, yes, I can. I came into science profoundly interested in how a fertilized egg grows into an adult. And the problem is called cell differentiation, and how 30,000 genes turn one another on and off to make the different cell types in your body. So I've worked on that. I've worked on the origin of life. I hold founding patents in what is now called combinatorial chemistry. I've started 4 companies. I lived in one of them. And I've had fun being a scientist. So this has led me to investigations, which in turn led to reinventing the sacred. And maybe you have to get antique, or at least older. I'm now 68 and 2/3 plus or minus a little bit. So this is the over 65 set. And part of what's driving me, Terry, is the following set of things. A global civilization of some form is emerging. We don't know whether it'll be homogeneous or forever heterogeneous, but it's driven by global commerce. It's driven by global communication. People, in response to it, are in part retreating into fundamentalisms that are often religious and often hostile. Meanwhile, we confront peak oil, that year when we will get the most oil out of the ground that we will get, which may be about now, with catastrophic possible consequences for our global economy, with global warming, water shortages, resource wars, death, hunger. And we profoundly lack a global ethic that we can share across the planet. We lack a shared sense of the sacred that we can share across the planet. And I think we've got to find it. And my book, Reinventing the Sacred, is my best shot at it.
Mm-hmm. And in the first lines of your book, I'm going to read. The title of this book, Reinventing the Sacred, states its aim. I will present a new view of a fully natural God and of the sacred based on a new emerging scientific worldview. And then you say, this new worldview reaches further than science itself and invites this new view of God, the sacred, and ourselves, ultimately including our science, art, ethics, politics, and spirituality. Ambitious. What is that new worldview, and what is the worldview it's replacing?
Can we start with the second?
Yes.
Okay. It's the view that it is replacing with the cautionary note of a scientist that I may be wrong. Okay?
Excellent.
All scientists are taught to say that because otherwise you get in trouble. And I may be wrong, but I don't think I am. We'll see when we get to the crux spot if we get there. So it really comes from Descartes, Galileo, Newton, Einstein, Schrödinger, okay, and was best stated by a French mathematician, Simon Pierre Laplace, in Napoleon's time, who said, if there were a superb intelligence, not meaning God, just a superb intelligence, that knew the positions and the velocities and the masses of all the particles in the universe, then using Newton's laws, that intelligence could compute the entire future and the entire past of the universe. The past because Newton's laws are time reversible. Now, there are three aspects of this reductionistic worldview.
And let me just, for some people probably hearing that, there were a lot of things in that. One of them was, it was the location and velocity of all the particles in the universe.
All the particles.
Okay.
All the particles. Absolutely essential. Thanks, Terry. So there are three aspects to this reductionism. The first is that everything is deterministic. That is to say, if you start things the same way, the same things will happen. And that comes from Newton's laws, which are deterministic. Well, within a century, quantum mechanics call that into question with the famous Copenhagen interpretation and what's called the Born rule, where things are probabilistic, and Einstein was upset with God playing dice with the universe. The second, which is the broadest in our Western world view, is what I'm about to tell you. It is the view that everything that happens in the universe is describable by natural law. I think that's wrong. And that is the most startling thing I'm going to say. I think I'm correct. I think it requires examination. If I'm right, it changes huge tracts of our view of the world, because I'm going to wind up saying that part of what happens in the evolution of the biosphere, the economy, human culture, and maybe even the abiotic universe is not describable by law. Instead, there's an endless creativity.
And let me say again to people to emphasize some of the nuances here. A lot of people, it seems to me, in fact, I've interviewed many of them over the years because it's something I'm looking at, will point out the first problem in that worldview, which is that the reductionist thing, that everything that everything went according to Newton's laws. And then you say, well, what about quantum physics? What about relativity? And so that one's out there. But the second one
is absolutely new.
Is new.
It's absolutely new. It is the most radical thing I'm saying in a chapter called Breaking the Galilean Spell. I do confess that the title Breaking the Galilean Spell came to me while I was taking a bath. And I thought it was too good to ignore, so I use it.
And let me tell
exactly
people, by the
what
way, the voice that you hear is Stuart Kaufman. He's the director of the Institute for Biocomplexity and Informatics at University of Calgary. And his most recent book is what we're talking about, Reinventing the Sacred, A New View of Science, Reason, and Religion. I'm Terry McNally. And if you want to learn more, in addition to the book, Resurrecting the Sacred, you could go to the edge.org, edge.org, and then look for this article, put in this article, Breaking the Galileo Spell. Galilean spell. Okay, so Galileo and everyone since has basically said we can explain things through natural laws. Stuart Kaufman says not so.
Correct. And we can go straight to it, Terry, if you want to. And I will ask the question of the audience that's listening that I've asked of everybody. But it takes about 2 to 3 minutes to say this. Okay. So suppose we went to Mr. Darwin and said, Darwin, what's the function of the heart? Say the human heart. Well, he would say it's to pump blood. And then we might say, but it makes heart sounds. And he would say, yes, but that's not the function of the heart. The heart was selected to pump blood. And basically, he's right. Okay, so there's a whole discussion there to be had because you see, when Darwin says the function of the heart's to pump blood, he discriminates between that which has been selected and that which hasn't. And the physicist can't do that. The physicist can talk about what is, but not a subset of the causal consequences of what is, namely pumping blood as opposed to making heart sounds. And that's part of the argument that biology is emergent with respect to physics.
Okay,
that's not the main point I want to make.
I know, but let me get into that one just for a second so people are with us. You said pumping blood, everyone thinks, okay, that's what the heart's for. Then you say heart sounds. When you select that, heart sounds, you just mean something else that the heart does or something else that happens if it's a heart,
correct,
but not the thing that we seem to focus on.
Exactly so.
Okay.
Another example is that when your heart pumps blood, water in your pericardial sac that holds the heart wiggles. Well, that isn't the function of the heart either.
It's not about wiggling.
It's not about wiggling.
Okay.
Jiggling would be more scientific. So here was Darwin's next wonderful idea. He said, you know what? I bet there are properties of, say, organs, like hearts, of no use whatsoever in the current environment, like jiggling water in the pericardial sac or making heart sounds, that might turn out to be useful in some quite different selective environment. So that's called now a Darwinian pre-adaptation, and famous Stephen Jay Gould call them exaptations, but it's the same idea. There's
pre-adaptation, something that existed and was an adaptation to an environment that organism or organ wasn't in at the time.
That's correct. And there is no notion in the phrase pre-adaptation of a designer, creator, God, intelligent design, or anything. It's just there. Okay. Now, I'm going to give a couple of examples. The first I'm going to talk about is something called a swim bladder. Some fish have an organ called a swim bladder. It's partially filled with air, partially filled with water. The amount of water in the swim bladder adjusts neutral buoyancy in the water column and keeps the fish turned upright. Okay? Here's how paleontologists believe that the swim bladder arose. So there are fish that have lungs. They're called lungfish. The thought is that water got into the lungs of the lungfish. Now you have a sac with air and water in it. It's on its way to becoming a swim bladder. Okay? So that's a Darwinian pre-adaptation. Now I'm going to ask some essential questions about it. First, did a new function come to exist in the biosphere, adjusting neutral buoyancy in the water column? Well, I think we'd both agree that the answer is obviously yes. Second, did it have an effect on the evolution of the biosphere? Sure, new species, new proteins, new molecules, so it had causal consequences. Now's my big question. I'm going to ask you, Terry.
Okay.
Ready? Do you think, honestly, that you could say ahead of time all possible Darwinian pre-adaptations for all organisms or, say, just for human beings?
No. In other words, you're saying, could I sit here now and tell you everything that is a descriptor or a function or something within us that we aren't using yet? Is that what you're saying?
That might turn out.
No, of course not, because what that stuff is difficult to see because of where we stand and where I look at this moment.
That's exactly right.
Now, so you're saying that the fact that we can't predict all of those is important?
It's good. Watch what happens. Now, it turns out that I've talked by now to thousands of people. We all say the same thing. We all say, nope, we cannot say ahead of time what Darwinian pre-adaptations are going to be in the biosphere, and it'll turn out in the economy and in human culture too. So we'll get there in a moment. Now, watch what happens. First of all, could we do what Newton told us to do? So here's what Newton told us to do about a billiard table. He said, look, here's a billiard table. It's got billiard balls on it. Name the variables, well, they're the billiard balls, and their positions and velocities and masses. Now name the laws among these variables. I just happened to write them down. Here's my 3 laws of motion. Now look at the boundary conditions, the edges of the billiard table. Now compute. Just go ahead. I invented the calculus. Compute what's going to happen, and lo and behold, you can compute what's going to happen. So that's Newton. Now let's ask, can we do that for the biosphere? Can we write down the variables such that we can talk about the evolution of the biosphere from before until after swim bladders come into existence?
Right. In other words, what both Newton and Laplace said, which was that if you know those mathematical pieces of information about the particles in the universe, you should be able to predict whatever's going to ever happen in the biosphere. And as you say, not just the biosphere, in human culture. And then you actually focus on human economy, which I think to some people will be one of the more interesting things. You pick up a book that seems to be a scientist talking about science and religion. Okay, that's a lot already. But you actually do put the human economy as a critical example, a world kind of worth studying that to you is another one of these exceptions to those predictive rules of these natural laws.
It is absolutely. And can we get there in a sec?
Yeah.
So let's just sort of stay where we are for a moment. So can we write down the Newtonian trick and do it for the biosphere? And the answer is no, because we do not know ahead of time the variables that are going to come into existence. We don't know the billiard balls. We don't know swim bladders, lungs, livers, noses, your middle ear bones, which evolved from 3 adjacent bones in an early fish. We don't know, so we can't do it. So we can't do what Newton said. And by the way, let me go back to part of why you said no, and we all do. One of them is, how would we say ahead of time what all selective environments are?
Right.
It seems impossible.
Yeah.
The second thing is, let's come back to the jaw bones. 3 adjacent jaw bones in an early fish became 3 adjacent bones in your middle ear, the incus malleus and stapes that help you hear. Had one of those bones been in the skull, one in the spine, and one in the jaw, would we have gotten the same thing in the middle ear? Almost certainly not. That means the spatial relations among those jaw bones mattered. So let's use the physicist's phrase, relational degrees of freedom. Do we have any way whatsoever to specify ahead of time the relationships among things within or between organisms that might turn out to be pre-adaptations in environments that we can't state? And the answer seems to be obviously no.
Now, let me say one thing. You're listening to Free Forum. I'm Terry McNally. I'm speaking with Stuart Kauffman. He's a molecular scientist, biocomplexity is his field. He's a MacArthur Fellow, but we're talking about his new book, Reinventing the Sacred, in which he takes on a heck of a lot more than that. I'm going to say we've got about 9 minutes more. And so I want us to move a little bit more into the implications of this rather than laying out the whole thing. If I had an hour or two, we'd do the whole thing.
But look, Terry, let me get one sentence beyond.
Yes, exactly.
Okay. Most people think a natural law is a compact description of the regularities of a process, like Newton's laws, or like Einstein's laws, or like Schrodinger's equation from quantum mechanics. Do you think we could have a natural law, for the emergence of swim bladders? Well, the answer seems to be obviously no. We can't even prestate the possibility. How could we have a law? Okay? That means something stunning. It means, if this is right, that contrary to what Laplace thought, Descartes thought, Galileo thought, Newton thought, and Einstein thought, what happens in the unfolding of the universe, at least the biosphere, maybe the whole universe, is partially beyond natural law. And it's from that the well springs flow, because it means a lot.
Well, let me just say one of the things that I take it to mean, and tell me if I'm right, because I was, explaining to someone earlier today, I'm going to go interview this guy, and this is kind of what he says, and I tried to, is that once life emerges, once there's something you call agency.
Yep.
And agency has something to do with will, it has something to do with choice, and once that emerges, then all that stuff that applied to pool balls, billiard balls, doesn't apply anymore. And one of the key things you say is the thing we were just talking about. You cannot predict all of that. And,
That's right.
and the fact that there is agency, that there is choice, that there is and choice, I don't mean to say conscious choice, right? In other words, life has an agency that still defies prediction.
That's right. We cannot predict how the biosphere is going to evolve. We just can't.
And why is that so critical? And what are the implications of that?
Well, the same thing's true in the economy. So I don't have time to tell you the story of the invention of the tractor, but it involves a similar...
Well, let me see if I can do it quickly again, because I tried to figure it out. Basically, the tractor had an engine case, right?
Yep.
That was too heavy for the ways they thought of putting it together.
Well, they were trying to put it on a chassis that would hold it, and it kept breaking chassis.
Right.
And finally, one of the engineers said, you know what? The engine block is so big and rigid, we can use the engine block itself as the chassis and hang everything off the engine block. And that's how tractors are made.
Right.
That's a Darwinian pre-adaptation. It's a causal...
The rigidity and weight of the chassis, which looked like a problem, actually was an opportunity.
Of the engine block.
Right.
And in fact, most inventions are used for purposes besides that for which they were invented. For example, when the computer was invented, nobody foresaw Facebook, right? I pick Facebook because it's the height of Western civilization. So what this means is that the same thing is true for the evolution of our economy and culture. It's not describable entirely by natural law. That means,
and one of the ways that you say, one of the key things there that I get from that is, how do you know something cannot be explained by natural law is if you cannot predict it from what you know right now.
Right. Okay. Now, let's look at consequence number one. The highest virtue, human virtue of the Enlightenment that we all love is reason. But what I just told you is we really don't know. In fact, I just talked to Jan Rivkin, who's in charge of teaching strategy at Harvard Business School, and he said, you know what? We have no methodology whatsoever. We just give them a lot of hard problems and hope they get good at it. And business people are precisely people who are trying to figure out what to do in a world when they don't know. That means that reason, our beloved reason, is an insufficient guide for living our lives. We need emotion. We need intuition, we need metaphor, we need story, we need whatever we can bring to bear that we've evolved over the last 3 billion years to manage to live our lives. I think, Terry, this means something enormous. It means that we have to re-understand our integrated humanity. We don't understand it. And that's why I say at the beginning of the book, this goes way beyond science. It involves art, politics, plumbing, the law, radio interviews,
and if I may, it goes to that thing that I said at the top, doesn't
Absolutely.
it? In other words, that's why when I read, when I started reading your stuff, I got so excited, which is that if, as I've seen happen in American society, if intelligence is just rationality,
it's insufficient.
Then it's easy to attack.
Right.
And what ends up happening is we then throw out the baby with the bathwater with people who sort of turn their back on rationality. What you're saying is that's because it isn't all that's going on. It isn't all that we have at our resource, with or without the words of a holy book or not.
That's right. So we have to re-understand and reintegrate our entire humanity. I truthfully believe we need a new enlightenment because, and then I want to get to God.
Very good.
But let me say this about the enlightenment, or a new enlightenment. We have to understand, if what we've said is correct, Terry, about partial lawlessness, then the view that we've had in the West is about reductionism and explaining everything is wrong. We have to understand what it is to be human in a world where in part we have laws, but in part we don't have it and we don't know. What does it mean to be fully human and make our way? So that's a huge topic, and it's going to take a long time to understand it. Now, if I may, let me turn to God. How many gods have we worshipped in the last 100,000 years? Lots.
Many.
At least 7. Okay. Our ideas about our Abrahamic God changed in the last 4,500 years. Well, Yahweh was a tough God. He was a warrior, law-giving God. And the
New Testament, the God of love, the God of compassion and mercy.
The New Testament is a God of love. I think God is a symbol that humanity has invented. And I think it is our choice whether or not we wish to use that symbol in a new way and reinvent God. And here's what I think we should think about. In place of law, in the becoming of the biosphere and human civilization, and maybe the whole universe, there is an incredible and ceaseless creativity. Let's distinguish between the creator God and the creativity of that God. Do we need the creator God anymore? I say we don't. We need the creativity. And we've got the creativity. It's here in this boundless creativity. We are children of this creativity. I'm going to tell one personal story that I think brings it home. I was sitting in my house up in Canada, and there's a hillside and a river right next to us. The hillside is covered with spruce and fir. And I looked at the spruce and fir, and I said, I could cut that down if I wanted to. But in my sense of God, that spruce and fir forest is God's work. How dare I? I'd better have a very good reason. Then I looked at the river, and I said, I could dam that river if I wanted to. But that's God's work. I'd better have a very good reason. You see, I think this view of God invites a sense of the sacred. The sacred becomes all of life on the planet.
Including us. Including us. That sits there and considers cutting down that forest or damming that
Become
river.
Part of the sacred.
You, in your creative response to the question you yourself raised, then your perception, and then your feeling, and then your resonance, and then your emotion, and then all of those things that went into that moment, that is part of the creativity, and that is God.
That's right. In this view, we're not made in God's image. We too are God. But so is the worm, the butterfly, the tree, and the planet.
And that God is the endless, boundless, continuous creativity of existence, or of life.
Of existence and of the natural world. So then the hope is we can get from a sense of the sacred to a global ethic that can guide us in the face of peak oil, water resources being limited, global warming, a global civilization. We have to do it, Terry. We're killing one another.
That's right. Our creativity is what has created the problems that we face.
Exactly.
In other words, it was our creativity that discovered the value of oil. It was our creativity that created the internet. It was our creativity that found the value of hygiene and thus led to enormous populations. And it is our creativity that must get us out of this, and that's the role of God. I got to wrap it up. The book is Reinventing the Sacred, a new view of science, reason, and religion. You can learn more by going to theedge.org, edge.org, and then looking for Stuart Kauffman, Kauffman, or his particular essay, Breaking the Galilean Spell. Thank you to G, my engineer, Stan Mizrahi in production, Matt Perez in traffic. To you, my listeners, I look forward to being with you again next week. Email me at temcnally, temcnally, at mac.com, temcnally at mac.com. If you want to receive my weekly announcement of who's going to be on and what we're going to talk about, if you want to learn more about the podcast, if you want to get transcripts, etc., you can listen to this conversation on my website. You've been listening to Freeform with Charlie McNally. Thank you, Stuart Kauffman. Keep up the good work.
Thank you so much.
You can also subscribe and listen to the Freeform podcast on most of those podcast sites and at my site. You can find years of podcasts at those sites and mine. Listen anytime, anywhere. Michael Lewis, Naomi Klein, Bill McKibben, Van Jones, Connie Rice, Greg Boyle, George Packer. You can also follow me on Twitter at McNally Terrence. Thanks to Kiana Williams in production, George Vasilopoulos of Progressive Voices, and most of all to you, my listeners. Please Share this podcast widely.